Tak. Już jadę.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the video. This is a series of videos in which I'm trying to improve my E36 drift car by swapping in a bigger engine. Last time a big milestone was reached as I've installed the M54B30 into the car. And now it's time to connect all the lines and hoses as well as wire up the engine so that we can start it and drive the car. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the build. When I installed the engine in the car, I hooked up a coolant hose which goes from the head into the heater. However, this hose is a bit too long and it got pinched, so I needed to shorten it. Because I knew I'm going to have to test fit the hose multiple times, I removed the intake manifold. When the hose was cut to the right size, I also had to make one new vacuum plug as one of those that I made before was too loose and fell off. And since I had the intake manifold removed, I also removed the strap that I used to lift the engine. I probably wasn't going to need it anymore anyway.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
When I reinstalled the intake manifold, I noticed that there was a connector that didn't seem to fit anywhere. I panicked a bit, but then I figured it out.
Spare loom here.
What? Well, I'll be damned. Pop.
Next up, I had to tackle one of the more difficult parts of the swap, the wiring. I only have a basic understanding of the electrics, but I had a general idea what needs to be connected where, and I also had my dad help me. There is one more problem though. This wiring harness came out of an automatic car, which means that there are multiple connectors that don't go anywhere. At first, I laid out all of the wiring to figure out what goes where, as well as which connectors I don't need.
Connected.
I hooked up all of the positive and negative terminals of the harness, but I later changed the positive cable to the one from the E36 so that I could connect both sides of the engine bay. I also prepared some wires that I'm going to need for connecting pins.
Sorry, Opel Corsa wiring harness, I gotta do this to ya.
Now let's get into the procedure. First, let me say that my ECU has been flashed and it's had its EWS deleted, along with some other things that would otherwise prevent me from starting the engine. This service is available at SKIDSHOP. You can either send your own ECU to be flashed, or order an already flashed ECU. You can also choose to have a bit more aggressive map installed, which is also something I did. Okay, so now to the wiring. Beside the wiring harness on your engine, you're also going to need an X20 connector from an E36 wiring harness, and a part of the harness out of an M54 car that goes to the electric throttle pedal. You're going to need to connect some wires from the X20 to the X60004 connector on the ECU, where the throttle is plugged in, and to the X6011, a white translucent connector on the wiring harness. The process is pretty straightforward, you just need to find the right pins on both sides and connect them with a wire. The only exception is the fuel pump. The ECU grounds the fuel pump pin to turn on the fuel pump, however you need a positive signal on the X20, which means that you have to wire in a relay to get that positive signal. Me and my dad connected everything and got the cluster working, but before we could start cranking the engine, I still had to fill the engine with oil as well as do some other stuff. For the oil, I went with 10W60, because we're not fucking around with the rod bearings in this thing. I went with Shell because it was the cheapest and apparently some Italians use it as well.
E Ferrari.
Next up, I had to tackle the O2 sensor problem from the previous video. To get the old O2 sensor out, I needed to lift the engine a little bit to get enough clearance. At first I thought I could lift it enough with the engine support beam, but it sadly didn't work. So I had to get the hoist, which also meant I had to put the strap back on the engine. Which was fun. Really fun. Especially in the back. I managed to find another O2 sensor that was also used by BMW, but this one didn't have a connector, so I had to solder it on. In the previous video I installed the shift linkage. Unfortunately it turns out that it's too short, and that means I can't get to all the gears. So I have to make one from scratch. I did the welding while my dad did the lathe stuff, and he also made me a new bushing for the other part of the linkage. The linkage fit nicely, but it was about a half a centimeter too long, so I had to shorten it, while making sure not to mess up the alignment of the pins. The test fit was successful, so I welded it for real. Now we need to get the fuel to the engine. The setup here is a bit different than on an E36, the feed and return line going to the fuel filter, while there is only one line coming from the filter into the fuel rail. Like with some E36s, the E46 has the filter mounted under the car. However, mine had the fuel filter in the engine bay, so I had to make a bracket to fit it under the car. In hindsight, this was probably not a very good idea, because now the filter is the lowest part of the car. And if at any point it happens that I go off track and hit the filter, be prepared to grab your popcorn and witness the most epic Viking burial as I go down in the flaming fireball of death. So yeah, I'll move the filter. And I also hooked up what I think is a fuel breather to the line that was previously used by the tank breather filter.
That's it, I guess.
The next thing that needs hooking up is the power steering. Because I ended up going with the M54 power steering pump, the fittings on the pump and the pressure line are different. Luckily, I had the cut piece of the line that goes into the pump, so I asked my dad to solder that piece on an existing line. I also replaced the low pressure feed and return hoses with brand new ones. I've also previously decided that I'm not going to be running the viscous fan and instead use an electric fan. So I picked up a used fan out of an E46. At first I thought that I'm going to have to make a fan shroud from scratch, but the one that came with the fan looked like it would fit the 325i E36 radiator that I'm using with some modifications, so I gave it a try. After some cutting it fit nicely, but unfortunately there was a clearance issue with the electric motor of the fan, so I had to offset the fan with a couple of washers to make it fit. When I had the fan and the radiator, it was time to connect the cooling hoses. I started with the lower hose that goes into the expansion tank. Here I needed to join a hose that comes out of the heater core, which I already installed, and another one that comes out of the head, which I bought new. But since BMW started using these special connectors on cooling hoses, you can't manipulate the hose at all. You can't even turn it. So I had to carefully remove the metal ring without damaging the hose or the connector and replace it with a good old hose clamp.
That's pretty good.
To join these hoses together, I used a steel cooling line I found lying around that could be trimmed into a T-piece. I also trimmed the rubber hoses to make everything fit nicely. During this time, me and my dad already tried to start the engine. We couldn't get a spark, and we also couldn't get the pump running. We were already troubleshooting for a while, but we still didn't get anything out of the ECU. Until we found a forum thread that also said to connect a positive signal on one of the pins of the X60004 connector. We hooked it up and then turned the key. That gremlin laugh you heard was me. I was super fucking excited and couldn't contain myself. After the engine finally started, we also tidied up the wiring.
Perfect. Oh. Perfect. Now we just put this in here somehow and then we close it down.
After that, the car was moved to the workshop so that the drivetrain could be modified. When I had the car on the lift, I started by removing the old diff and axles that I'm going to replace with bigger variants. I went from the small case 160/80 diff on axles to medium case 188. If you're wondering what those numbers mean, it's the diameter of the flanges in millimeters. One easy way to tell them apart is to check the number of bolts on the cover of the diff. The small case has 6 and the medium has 8. I installed the diff and the axles, but I had a bit of a harder time with axles as the car is lowered. I only got 6 bolts with the axles, so I won't be able to sand it for real until I get the remaining bolts. Now it was time to tackle the driveshaft. Due to the new engine outputting significantly more power, the differential as well as the transmission were upgraded. New components are therefore a bit longer, which means that the driveshaft needs to now be shorter. And the new ZF transmission also has a different output flange, so that the front part of the driveshaft needs to be changed. I got a driveshaft out of an E36 320D as a donor, and then me and my dad measured how long the front part needs to be. The rear part was also too long for about 2 centimeters. I wanted to get it shortened, but my dad insisted that it'd be fine if I just modified the mount of the middle bearing. I took the driveshaft to a specialized shop to have it modified, and in the meantime I was trying to figure out how to fit and modify the rest of the cooling hoses. When I got the driveshaft back, it was time to install it back into the car.
I'm gonna need some hammering. And would you look at that? It does indeed fit. Wonderful.
I decided to put safety nuts on the middle driveshaft bearing because I don't fully trust the modification.
Safety nuts here. Because this is modified and I really don't want it to come off.
I also installed the lower reinforcements and heat shields.
Pedal time.
The next thing to take care of was the throttle pedal. As I mentioned in the previous video, the M50 used a mechanical throttle with a cable, but the new M54 uses an electric throttle pedal. There were still some components of the previous setup that I had to remove. Then I had to feed the wires through the firewall. I had a little problem here because the connector was too big, so I had to cut the wires and solder them back together. Another modification that I did was a custom 3D printed pedal bracket. I first wanted to put in the OEM part out of an E36, but when I did so, the pedal wasn't straight, which I hated. I could have just moved the original mounting point, but I found modeling a new part and having it printed an easier option for me. It's not perfect, but I think it should be fine.
There we go.
And I also put the seats back in the car. Next thing I installed was the shift knob. At first I thought that the one that came with the car was unusable, because the previous owner probably didn't have the special bolts to bolt it down, and so he just filled it with some liquid rubber, slapped it on, and called it a day. I spent almost half a day cleaning it out, but when I did, I could install it back in the car properly this time. I didn't want my ECU to move about while driving, and the taps for the previous ECU didn't work on this one. So I decided to make a special holder for it. I modeled it, while two of my friends who own 3D printers printed it for me. Even though that this is version 1 and it's not perfect, it's surprisingly good and it fits pretty well.
Thank you, man. Adela! Let's go!
Bam.
I still had to figure out what to do with the lower radiator hose. None of the hoses I had fit, and at this point I've already cut up pretty much all of my hoses, hoping that one would fit.
That one was a fail. This one doesn't work. This one not a chance.
So I had to make something with the pieces that I had. I ended up with this. It's not the most elegant solution, but it should work. With the cooling system reassembled, I decided to partly reassemble the front end so that the next morning I could start the car and bleed the system.
Oh, Jumbo! Then?
I filled up the radiator with coolant, but before I started the car, I wanted to have a fan running. I didn't yet have enough electrical hardware to wire in the big electric fan I've put in, so I decided to temporarily install the secondary AC fan that I was using before.
Dixon 3.
I started the car and started bleeding the system, both the power steering and cooling. Everything was going to plan until this happened.
What the fuck?
Yeah, just a little pro tip, when you're starting the car, do make sure your fuel lines are connected properly. You wouldn't want any fires. I reconnected the fuel line and continued bleeding the system. I didn't have any more mishaps and she happily chugged all the coolant.
Final little piece, this lovely radiator guard.
When I picked up the necessary hardware, I wired the bigger electric fan. I wired it into a switch in the car through a relay. with that, the swap is pretty much finished. I still need to get an exhaust made, and when I get those axle bolts, I'll be able to take it for a test drive. Of course, I'm planning on documenting all of that as well. Before you go, I'd like to say that if you enjoyed the video as well as the series, I would really appreciate it if you give it a like, maybe even subscribe to be notified when new videos come out. It helps out a lot, but if for some reason you don't want to, that is also fine. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully I was able to provide you with a couple hours of entertainment. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!